For centuries, the Forbidden City in Beijing was the beating heart of China's empire. From the outside, its crimson walls and golden roofs dazzled with majesty, radiating order, harmony, and the power of the Son of Heaven. But step beyond the gates, and a different world unfolded, a labyrinth of palaces and hidden chambers where power and pleasure intertwined, where rituals of state blurred with rituals of flesh. This was not only the emperor's court. It was his prison, his theater, and, at times, his maze of forbidden desires. Built in the early 15th century during the Ming Dynasty, the Forbidden City was designed to embody the cosmic order. Its layout mirrored the universe itself, with every courtyard and chamber aligned according to strict principles of feng shui. But within this grand design was a darker truth. The emperor was not only the ruler of China, he was a man of flesh and hunger, surrounded by temptations and guarded by eunuchs whose whispers carried power equal to ministers. The farther one went beyond the outer gates, the deeper one descended into secrecy. The outer courts displayed ceremony and control. Here, ministers bowed low before the dragon throne, rituals honored the ancestors, and edicts determined the fate of millions. But behind the central halls, in the inner court, lay the emperor's private world, a space walled off from politics, yet no less political. It was here, among the women of the imperial harem, that dynasties rose or faltered, that whispers of love or betrayal shaped the empire's destiny. The harem itself was vast. At its peak, it could hold thousands of women, empresses, consorts, concubines, and attendants, each ranked in a hierarchy so complex that even eunuchs struggled to memorize it. These women lived their lives in gilded cages, competing for the emperor's attention, knowing that a single night in his bed could elevate their family to fortune, or condemn them to a lifetime of obscurity. Every gesture, every smile, every word spoken within those chambers was calculated. The Forbidden City was not only a palace, it was a battlefield of seduction. At the center of this world stood the emperor, isolated, untouchable, but paradoxically trapped. The Son of Heaven could command armies, but within the crimson walls he was constantly surrounded by spies. Eunuchs controlled who entered his chambers. Ministers fought to place their daughters in his bed. Every concubine was both a potential lover and a pawn in the endless chess game of court politics. And while the emperor's desires shaped the knights, it was often the eunuchs who shaped the choices, feeding him pleasures while weaving their own influence around his throne. Legends tell of secret passageways connecting the emperor's quarters to hidden pavilions. Some claimed that at night, eunuchs would escort selected concubines through these shadowed halls, chosen not by the emperor's will, but by the whispering intrigues of those who served him. The harem was not only about intimacy, it was about control. A single night of passion could determine the balance of power at court, as the favored woman's family suddenly gained influence, while rivals plotted revenge in silence. Life inside the inner court was governed by ritual. When the emperor wished to summon a concubine, the choice was often recorded in official documents. Women were bathed, perfumed, dressed in silk, then delivered on a quilt carried by eunuchs to the imperial bed. Even desire was bureaucratized. But beneath the formality lay tension and fear. For the emperor, indulgence was his privilege. For the women, it was a test of survival. The walls of the Forbidden City kept the outside world away, but within those walls, rumors multiplied. Stories of emperors who spent their nights wandering from chamber to chamber, seeking distraction in endless pleasure. Stories of concubines who rose to power not only through beauty, but through manipulation, alliances, and betrayal. Stories of eunuchs who deliberately exhausted their master with excess, ensuring that his strength declined while theirs grew. For the people beyond the gates, the Forbidden City was a symbol of divine authority, a palace untouched by mortal flaws. But inside, the reality was far more human, and far more dangerous. It was a place where the emperor, though surrounded by wealth, was constantly at risk of being devoured by his own palace. Ministers controlled politics by day, eunuchs by night, and every indulgence risked becoming a chain. The maze of pleasure was also a maze of power, and no emperor could ever fully escape it. In the Ming Dynasty, emperors like Zhengde became infamous for abandoning state affairs to indulge in the harem's pleasures, disguising himself at night to wander the city with concubines. Later, under the Qing, emperors such as Qianlong and Yongjing maintained strict control, yet whispers of secret chambers and forbidden rituals never ceased. Behind the orderly rituals of Confucian governance, the undercurrent of desire remained. The forbidden city's beauty concealed its darkness. The red gates kept secrets as well as enemies. The golden roofs reflected sunlight by day, but by night, shadows stretched long across courtyards where footsteps echoed, where whispered names determined fates, and where the emperor, divine in the eyes of his subjects, was reduced to a man navigating his own labyrinth of lust, politics, and isolation. The dragon gates promised power and eternity. But once inside, the emperor faced a different truth. He was the center of the universe, yet trapped in its maze. If the outer courts of the forbidden city embodied ritual, order, and majesty, the deeper one traveled into the inner court, the more those masks slipped away. Here, behind painted screens and gilded doors, the emperor lived not as a god but as a man of flesh. And in these chambers, hidden from the world's gaze, desire became ritual, lust became politics, and the line between sacred duty and indulgence blurred into shadow. Legends and historical whispers describe secret chambers that only the emperor and his closest attendants ever saw. Some were modest, decorated with silk and incense burners. Others were elaborate, hidden pavilions tucked deep in the palace gardens, accessible only by winding passageways guarded by eunuchs sworn to silence. Within these spaces, the emperor could indulge without restraint, far from the scrutinizing eyes of ministers or officials. It was said that once the crimson doors closed, the Son of Heaven ceased to be a ruler of millions. He became a man trapped by his own loneliness, seeking solace in pleasures that both comforted and consumed him. The selection of women who entered these chambers was a process wrapped in both ritual and intrigue. The imperial harem was vast, thousands of women at its height, each ranked in strict hierarchy, the empress at the pinnacle, followed by consorts, concubines, and attendants. But in reality, few ever caught the emperor's eye. To be chosen for a night was not random, it was calculated. Eunuchs often wielded immense influence, controlling which names were presented, which women were bathed and prepared, and which were quietly set aside. In this way, the emperor's desires were never entirely his own. They were shaped, channeled, and manipulated by those who stood behind him in shadow. When the emperor summoned a woman, the ritual unfolded with bureaucratic precision. Her name was recorded. She was bathed in fragrant oils, dressed in fresh silk, and carried on a quilt to the emperor's bedchamber by eunuchs, so that her feet never touched the ground. The Son of Heaven did not sully himself with the messiness of seduction. Desire itself was staged, choreographed like theater. Yet for the women, every gesture mattered. A smile, a glance, a touch could mean survival or downfall. The emperor's chambers were not merely spaces for intimacy, they were battlegrounds. Concubines knew that a single night of favor could elevate their families to wealth and power. They also knew that a careless word, a moment of displeasure, could end in exile to the cold shadows of the palace, never to be summoned again. The harem's women competed silently, weaving alliances, trading secrets, and sometimes plotting against one another. The walls of these chambers absorbed not only whispers of passion but also whispers of poison and betrayal. For the emperor himself, the chambers were paradoxical. They offered freedom from ritual, yet they were another kind of prison. Surrounded by countless women, he was often the loneliest man in the empire. Surrounded by indulgence, he was rarely satisfied. Some emperors sought distraction in endless rotation, visiting different chambers each night. Others fixated on a single woman, elevating her above all others, upsetting the fragile balance of the harem and igniting jealous rivalries that rippled through court politics. History remembers emperors like Zhengde of the Ming dynasty, who abandoned governance for the pleasures of hidden chambers, disguising himself to slip out of the palace at night in search of forbidden adventures. His chambers became dens of indulgence, filled with wine, entertainers, and courtesans, while ministers despaired at the neglect of state affairs. Later, emperors like Qianlong of the Qing dynasty kept tighter control, but even he was not immune to the seductions of secret indulgence. Behind the careful facade of Confucian virtue, the chambers remained active, alive with rituals of pleasure. Daoist alchemists sometimes entered these spaces, whispering secrets of immortality. They taught that the emperor could strengthen his life force, the yang, by absorbing the essence of young concubines. What might have begun as a spiritual teaching twisted into exploitation. Girls, sometimes barely beyond childhood, were selected not for their beauty but for their youth, delivered to chambers where they became sacrifices to the emperor's obsession with eternal life. These acts were justified as divine practice, but they left trails of broken bodies and whispers of cruelty hidden beneath the silk. Eunuchs were ever present in this world. Castrated men sworn to service, they were both guardians and manipulators. They controlled the gates of the chambers, decided which concubines were chosen, and sometimes used their influence to destroy rivals or enrich themselves. The emperor trusted them because they could not father children, yet in truth, they became power brokers as dangerous as any minister. They watched everything, reported whispers, and shaped the emperor's pleasures to their advantage. In the Forbidden City, even desire was political. The chambers also mirrored the emperor's mental state. Some rulers used them sparingly, retreating to them for solace when burdened by the weight of empire. Others drowned in them, preferring silk sheets and perfumed bodies to the cold duties of governance. In times of stability, indulgence seemed harmless. But in times of crisis, when famine struck or rebellions rose, the sight of an emperor lost in pleasure while his people starved became dangerous. The chambers that once shielded him became symbols of corruption, fueling resentment beyond the palace walls. And yet, the allure of the chambers endured. They promised escape, comfort, and affirmation of power. To the emperor, every night spent within them was a reminder that he was the axis of the world, the man for whom hundreds of women competed. To the concubines, every night was a gamble between fortune and oblivion. And to the eunuchs, every night was an opportunity to tighten their grip on the throne. The Forbidden City's secret chambers were not merely places of lust, they were engines of power. Within them, families rose and fell, policies shifted, and dynasties were shaped. What the world outside never saw was that behind the dragon throne, behind the rituals of Confucian virtue, the empire itself was vulnerable to the passions of one man and the ambitions of those who served him. Behind those doors, the emperor was both master and prisoner, free to indulge, yet trapped in a system that fed him pleasure while draining his will. The chambers promised comfort, but they also whispered ruin. And as history would show, the maze of desire behind the crimson walls was not only a refuge for emperors, it was a slow poison, seeping into the very foundations of China's throne. If the secret chambers of the Forbidden City offered the emperor comfort and indulgence, they also became the stage for something more disturbing, rituals cloaked in the promise of immortality. For emperors who ruled with absolute power yet feared the march of time, the idea of eternal life was irresistible. And within the walls of their palace, Daoist alchemists, court physicians, and sorcerers whispered that longevity could be achieved not by elixirs alone, but through acts of flesh. What began as philosophy twisted into ritual. What was meant to align body with cosmos often became exploitation, feeding emperors' hunger for both life and lust. The belief rested on the duality of yin and yang, the cosmic forces that governed the universe. Yin represented the feminine, cool, receptive. Yang represented the masculine, hot, active. To maintain health, balance was essential. But some Daoist practitioners taught a darker variation, that the emperor, by draining the yin essence of young women through sexual union, could strengthen his yang energy, replenishing his vitality and extending his life. The more youthful and pure the partner, the stronger the effect. Thus, the concubines of the Forbidden City became more than companions, they became vessels of life force, consumed in the emperor's quest to defy mortality. The rituals often began with ceremony. Selected concubines, sometimes chosen for their youth more than their beauty, were prepared in secrecy. They were bathed, perfumed, dressed in silk of auspicious colors. Incense filled the chambers, while Daoist priests or eunuchs whispered incantations. The emperor entered not only as man but as son of heaven, performing what was presented as a sacred union. Yet behind the veil of ritual, it was little more than exploitation sanctified by superstition. Some records describe emperors who believed they must avoid releasing their own essence, their yang, during these encounters. Instead, they sought to absorb their partner's yin, leaving the young concubine drained, weakened, sometimes ill. In extreme cases, Girls died after repeated summons, their bodies sacrificed to the emperor's obsession with immortality. Yet their suffering was hidden behind silk screens and crimson walls, erased from official history. To the empire, the Son of Heaven remained strong, radiant, eternal. The Ming and Qing dynasties both carried whispers of such practices. The Jiajing emperor of the Ming, for example, became notorious for his devotion to Daoist alchemists who prescribed sexual rituals as pathways to longevity. He surrounded himself with hundreds of young virgins, believing that their essence could restore his strength. The result was cruelty on a staggering scale. Girls were taken from their families, locked within the palace, reduced to offerings for one man's fears. And though officials sometimes objected, few dared speak openly against the emperor's private rituals. To question them was to question his divine mandate. In the Qing dynasty, emperors cloaked themselves more tightly in Confucian virtue, but even then, rumors persisted. The Qianlong emperor, who reigned into his 80s, was admired for his longevity, yet some whispered that his vitality was sustained by Daoist practices within the harem. Whether true or not, the belief in sexual alchemy never fully faded. Behind the orderly ceremonies of court, the chambers remained laboratories of flesh where immortality was tested at the cost of concubines' lives. For the women, these rituals were cages within cages. They had entered the forbidden city already trapped, taken as concubines, cut off from the outside world. Now they were reduced further, to instruments of ritual. Some clung to the hope that favor with the emperor might elevate their families. Others sank into despair, knowing that their youth was being consumed like a candle burned too quickly. Eunuchs controlled their movements, priests cloaked their suffering in mysticism, and history reduced them to shadows. The emperor himself was often blind to the damage he wrought. Surrounded by flatterers, convinced of his divine role, he believed he was participating in sacred rites. In truth, he was devouring his empire from within. Every concubine drained was a daughter lost to a family. Every night spent in ritual was a night stolen from governance. And every act of exploitation deepened the rot inside the palace walls, where the illusion of immortality concealed the reality of decline. The rituals also warped the meaning of power itself. For the emperor, sex ceased to be intimacy. It became transaction, extraction, a tool in his endless battle against time. Pleasure was secondary to superstition. The harem, already a political battlefield, became an alchemical workshop, where flesh was fuel and desire was ritualized into cruelty. What should have been private became cosmic theater, watched over by eunuchs and priests, recorded in secret texts, whispered about long after emperors turned to dust. Outside the walls, the people suffered. Famines came, rebellions rose, corruption spread. Yet within the forbidden city, emperors spent their nights chasing eternal life between silk sheets. Ministers who dared to protest found themselves silenced or exiled. The empire bled while its ruler sought immortality in the bodies of girls. And though the emperor lived in luxury, his fear was clear. He could conquer armies, command millions, yet he could not conquer death. Ironically, many emperors who indulged in such rituals died not in glory, but in misery. Some were poisoned by the very elixirs their alchemists prescribed, mercury and arsenic touted as elixirs of life. Others weakened themselves through excess, drained not by yin or yang, but by their own obsessions. Their deaths revealed the futility of the rituals, yet the cycle continued, as each new ruler feared the same shadow of mortality. For the forbidden city, these practices left scars. They filled the palace with whispers of ghosts, the spirits of concubines sacrificed, the echoes of suffering behind silk curtains. They eroded respect for the throne, for when the emperor was seen not as wise ruler but as greedy seeker of immortality, the mandate of heaven seemed fragile. And they planted the seeds of decline, for an empire led by superstition and indulgence could not withstand the storms beyond its walls. The pleasure maze was no mere metaphor. Within those chambers, corridors twisted like a labyrinth, connecting hidden rooms where the emperor pursued his immortality. But the true maze was spiritual, a trap of fear and desire, where rulers wandered in circles, chasing eternity while time slipped silently past. In the end, the rituals gave them no more life than any other man. What they left behind was not eternal strength, but eternal caution, a reminder that when rulers confuse desire for divinity, they doom not only themselves, but their dynasties. The Forbidden City stood as a symbol of power, its crimson walls stretching endlessly, its golden roofs gleaming like the sun itself. From the outside, it promised eternity, order, stability, and the divine presence of the Son of Heaven. But inside those walls, decay was already spreading. The emperor, trapped in a labyrinth of pleasure and fear, withdrew further into indulgence, while beyond the gates, his empire began to crumble. What had been built as a fortress of cosmic harmony became a prison of decadence, and within its hidden chambers, the seeds of decline took root. By the later Ming dynasty, stories of emperors lost in indulgence became common. Zhengde abandoned governance for escapades with concubines and wine, while Jiajing buried himself in Daoist rituals that drained countless young women. The empire's officials despaired as their rulers turned inward, more concerned with the pleasures of the bedchamber than the famine, corruption, and rebellions that plagued the land. The Forbidden City, once the stage for imperial majesty, became a cocoon where emperors hid from the harshness of reality. Inside, corruption flourished. Eunuchs, who guarded the gates of the inner court, amassed extraordinary power. They decided which concubines would enter the emperor's chambers, which petitions would reach his hands, even which truths he was allowed to hear. Ministers might command armies, but eunuchs commanded the emperor's knights, and in that leverage lay the fate of dynasties. While emperors drowned in silk and incense, eunuchs enriched themselves, twisting the empire's veins of power into their own webs of control. For the concubines, life became more perilous. In theory, they were companions of the Son of Heaven, chosen to share his divine presence. In reality, they were pawns, trapped in endless competition for his fleeting favor. Some rose to immense influence, whispering into the emperor's ear, reshaping policies through seduction. Others languished in obscurity, their youth wasted, their lives forgotten. And some, unlucky enough to be chosen for immortality rituals, were consumed, physically and spiritually, in the emperor's futile struggle against time. Their suffering left no trace in official records, but it lingered in the silent corridors of the palace, in shadows that seemed to watch from carved screens and painted walls. The emperor himself grew more isolated. Surrounded by women who sought to please him, by eunuchs who manipulated him, by priests who promised him eternity, he became less ruler than captive. The Forbidden City's grandeur turned to confinement. Every courtyard was guarded. Every passageway monitored. Beyond the gates stretched an empire of hundreds of millions, yet the Son of Heaven walked in circles within his maze of walls, his world reduced to chambers of silk and stone. Power without freedom, indulgence without peace. This was the paradox of the throne. Meanwhile, outside those walls, the empire strained under the weight of neglect. Taxation crushed peasants while harvests failed. Soldiers went unpaid, and border defenses weakened. Corruption spread like fire, as officials, seeing the emperor lost in pleasure, helped themselves to power and wealth. Rebellions grew, storms gathered. The people whispered that the mandate of heaven, the divine right that justified the emperor's rule, had been lost. And always, the palace loomed above them, a glittering reminder of rulers who feasted while their subjects starved. The Qing dynasty that followed promised stricter rule. Its emperors, especially Kangxi and Yongjing, sought to restore order. Yet even then, the shadows of indulgence lingered. The Qianlong emperor, famed for his long reign, presided over great cultural achievements but also left whispers of excess in the palace chambers. By the time of the later Qing, corruption among eunuchs and concubines once again hollowed out the throne, and the Forbidden City's grandeur felt more like an echo than a reality. Decay behind the walls did not always come in the form of open scandal. Sometimes it was silence. The silence of an emperor who withdrew into his chambers and ignored the petitions of his ministers. Sometimes it was the silence of eunuchs who deliberately withheld news, ensuring the emperor lived in a world of illusions while rebellion burned beyond the gates. And sometimes it was the silence of concubines whose lives ended in obscurity, their names erased, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, their youth devoured by a system that fed on their very existence. The Forbidden City's pleasure maze was not built in stone, it was woven from secrecy, ritual, and fear. Each emperor who walked its corridors found himself ensnared, repeating the same cycle: indulgence, manipulation, isolation, decline. Some resisted, throwing themselves into governance and rejecting indulgence. But many succumbed, and in their weakness, the empire suffered. The walls that had been built to protect the dynasty instead became barriers that kept reality out, until the empire within them rotted away. By the 19th century, the Forbidden City stood as both wonder and warning. Foreign envoys marveled at its golden halls and intricate carvings, yet they also saw a court detached from reality, a dynasty weakened by indulgence and corruption. The palace that had once embodied cosmic harmony now embodied decline. And when the Qing dynasty finally collapsed in the early 20th century, the Forbidden City remained, its walls intact, its roofs gleaming, but its rulers gone, its secrets exposed as relics of a fallen age. Even today, as visitors walk through its courtyards, the shadows remain. Tourists marvel at the dragon throne, at the carved gates and painted halls, but few realize that behind those walls, generations of rulers lost themselves in a maze of their own making. The echoes of their footsteps linger, carrying whispers of concubines, eunuchs, and emperors who sought eternity but found only decay. The Forbidden City was built to last forever. In its way, it did. Its walls still stand, its golden roofs still shine. But what it contained, its rituals of lust, its manipulations of power, its prisons of pleasure, proved fatal to the dynasties that lived within. The empire could not be sustained by indulgence. And so, the Forbidden City's true legacy is not only one of beauty and power, but of warning, that even the mightiest rulers, surrounded by luxury, can be undone by the shadows behind their own gates. Enjoyed this hidden tale? Show support with a like, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe.